Hello everyone, my name is Barbara and I would like to welcome you all to our latest Novedge webinar episode. This week, what's new in Cinema 4D Release 16? Get the general overview of Cinema 4D Release 16's powerful, soon-to-be released 3D animation, rendering, modeling, and texturing tools. Presenting this webinar is Patrick Goski, a freelance 3D generalist and training specialist for MAXON. Patrick has been providing video content for Cineversity.com and has also worked as a technical director on several music videos that have received nominations for MTV Music Video Awards for Best Visual Effects. Before we get going, here's an overview of what we do at Novedge. Novedge is one of the largest online design software stores. We offer a huge assortment of software solutions that cater to virtually every designer's need. Put us to the test and come visit our webpage at novedge.com. And as you can see, we have a special bundle promotion going on right now. All the details and the many benefits to buying Cinema 4D are listed on this Novedge blog post, How to Save the Most on Cinema 4D and Get Release 16. I urge you to read it and take advantage of the many great savings. This offer expires on Friday, August 29th, so you have 2 more days. Take advantage. And for daily software news and limited time promotions, follow us on Facebook, Google+, and Twitter. Coming up in 2 weeks, architecture renderings with Rhino and Atlantis. This webinar will start with a short overview of a project in Rhino 5, and then we will move to the project into Atlantis to add texture and shaders, 3D object, and billboards. We will then explore how to generate sections, elevation, perspective, and VR movies. Last but not least, today's presentation is free and it's being recorded live. If you want to rewatch this or any webinar episode, you can find it on our YouTube and Vimeo channel. Just search for Novedge. And now I will pass the baton to Patrick. I'm going to make him the presenter and let you dazzle with the new Cinema 4D Release 16. Patrick, are you ready?
I am ready. Thank you very much, Barbara.
Fantastic.
All right, so my screen should be visible now. I guess just let me know when it is.
Okay, I will. It is
Everyone
now.
see it?
Okay, showtime.
Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. It is my pleasure to get to show off Cinema 4D version 16. We do have quite a few new features that have been added to the software, but definitely today I will be showing a couple of the standout features. These are probably the biggest ones that are going to be affecting people and your workflow. So I think the thing that I'm going to start with is going to be the #1 feature that we've added, which is the motion tracker. And this allows you to track cameras that are moving through your 3D space, or technically from footage, and extract the 3D camera. So when you open up Cinema 4D, you're going to find the motion tracker in the Studio bundle. And this menu is going to contain everything that you need to start getting into your camera tracking solution. You do have a couple of options when you start out. You can add the motion tracker itself, which is going to allow you to manually track the footage, or you can do a fully automatic solution by choosing Full Solve from the menu. So when you click on Full Solve, you are going to be given the option to find the footage that you want to work on, and we're just going to go to Camera Track here and load in some footage. And once you load the footage in, you'll see in the status bar it's preloading the footage. That means that it's taking the footage that you selected and it's resampling that. So essentially it's kind of just downsampling the whole thing so that you have a smaller memory footprint for the footage that's being cached. Once it's been preloaded, it gets tracked. And you'll see that in the viewport I have all these little purple diamonds with lines going around them. And those are actually all of my tracking points. So if I scroll through the time, you'll be able to see the tracking points move along with the footage. If you take a look back at the status bar, you'll see that it's already running the 3D solver. So at this point, it's taking those tracking points and it's converting those into a 3D camera move. And usually this is fairly speedy. The great thing about the motion tracker in Cinema 4D is even with the calculations happening, you can keep working inside of your scene. So you could be setting up things like your ground planes, sky domes, whatever else you need in there. And then whenever you see the status bar finish, you can go right back to the motion tracker and continue working with that. So the final step here is the optimization, and that's almost done. And once the optimization is finished, we get a 3D camera sitting inside the viewport with a whole bunch of nulls laying inside of the scene. So all of these null objects are color-coded, and this is to represent the error percentage of the actual tracks. So each one of those 2D tracks that we saw before, so if I go back to my camera here, each one of these purple little diamonds is now converted into a null in 3D space. And every null is given a color value. So bright green is going to be the most accurate track. And then as we go down here, you'll see that they eventually start turning to red. This means that these are probably not the best tracks, but they were good enough for the actual tracking solution. So once we have these, we do have a fairly decent solution. If I click on play, you'll see that all those null objects are moving very well with the footage itself. But if I go back to my orthographic views here, and let's just stop playing so we can see all of those, we can see that the alignment of the actual nulls in 3D space isn't very good. Essentially, it's angled, and what we want to work with is something that's nice and flat. So we could technically take the motion tracker and try to rotate this whole thing to get these lined up. But we do have something that's a lot easier. Inside of the motion tracker, we have constraints. So I can just tear off this constraint menu, and that is going to allow me to add in whatever constraints I need. So the first one that we'll do is the position constraint. And when I click on this, it's going to allow me to select any of these tracking markers and set that as the world 0 for the entire project. So pretty much I find just a point in space, let's say the base of the lamppost, and I click on that, and that's going to set that as the world 0. So you'll see now in the orthographic views I have that one point, and it is zeroed out in world space. We do have a couple of options inside the attributes manager. We have position attributes, which will allow you to offset this value, and there's also a link field for targets. With this link field, I can then drag in any one of these null objects into the link field and have that adjusted automatically. The next constraint that we have is going to be the planar constraint. And with this one, it's going to allow us to set the ground plane for our actual scene. So with the Create Planar Constraint tool active, I simply click on 3 of these tracking points. And once I do that, you'll see in the orthographic views, we're going to have a gray triangle. And this gray triangle represents the ground plane. If you take a look at the attributes manager, you will also see that there is a link field for selections. Now, when you're using the tool, it's only going to consider the first 3 null objects that you click on. But in the selection link field, you can actually click on your pick mode to add more of these tracking points to the actual averaged ground plane. And so this is going to help just kind of get something that lays a little more flat on the ground. So I'm going to exit out of the pick session, and you'll see that the scene still hasn't reoriented itself. This is because I still need to set an axis for the plane. So I'm going to set this to the y-axis, and you'll see once I do that, it's going to lay flat against the ground plane here. Now, I might want to try and remove a couple of these markers, just because it's not perfectly flat yet. And let's see. Let's go ahead and take that one out. And this is all kind of nice because it does update fairly automatically. Let's go ahead and click off the motion tracker, and then we can choose some of these manually like this too. And you can try at a different point in time, and then that should give us something nice and flat. And that looks about correct. So once you've set up your planar constraint, the one thing that can happen is when you initially set these, sometimes the camera doesn't know if it's supposed to be up here or down here. And in these cases, you have a checkbox to reverse the axis. And clicking this simply flips the whole plane. So you can either have the camera up here or down below. Finally, you have the vector constraint. And the vector constraint is what you're going to use to align the scene to one of the main axes of your project. So for this, what I probably want to do is align this front side here along the x-axis. So I want to pretty much find a couple of tracking points that lay along that axis. So we'll just kind of find one over here and one over here. And once I've done that, I then go to the axis drop-down and select X. And that's going to be the axis that I want these to sit along. Again, just because of the way that the solver works, it doesn't always know which side the camera is supposed to be on. So we do have the reverse axis. And doing that is going to set it up so that my z-axis is going back in space, which is exactly what I want. For setting up the scene scale, you can then set the length on the vector constraint. If you go with unknown, then the scene scale is going to be relative to whatever you're working on. If you set this to known, then you are able to set an actual value here. Now, unfortunately, when I was recording this footage, I didn't have a chance to run out and measure this. So we're going to kind of have to guess. But we can say 30 feet and hit enter, and that should be more or less what we want. So now you can see, if I go back here, that we have the scene scaled to represent a 30-foot value between those couple of points on the vector constraint. At this point, you can actually start bringing objects into your scene. So we can bring in like a cube and move that up to the ground plane. And my initial plane still isn't that good, so let's go ahead and create a new planar constraint here. Just like so. And let's try that again. Planar, and click there, and there, and there, and set that to the y-axis. There we go. So that is quite a bit better. And then if we hit play, you can see that the cube tracks nicely with our footage. Now, the automatic tracking is pretty solid, but every once in a while you're going to get footage that isn't so easily trackable. And for those cases, there are actually a lot of manual tracking features that have been added to the motion tracker. So in this case, we can add the motion tracker from the start, and then go to the footage menu here and load in our footage. And once you've loaded in the footage, this is where you can start adjusting things manually. The first is with the resampling. So if you're working with, say, 4K footage or 1080p, you have the option of downsampling that so that it fits inside of your available RAM, and also so that it's a little bit easier to track with. If you do need to, though, you can set the resampling to 100% and it will be pixel perfect. In this case, let's just go with 75%. The other thing that you have here is an option for the brightness. This is great just if you want to be able to see the actual tracks themselves a little bit more visible on the footage. Since the tracking markers are bright purple, having the brightness lower really makes those pop out. The next thing that you want to do to set up tracking manually, or at least semi-manually, is then go to the 2D tracking tab. And this starts with the automatic tracking tab. In here, you can define the number of tracks that you want to set. So if I click on Create Auto Tracks, what you'll see is, and I just have to go back to the Move tool from here, it's going to set up all of these tracks. Now, I can undo that and change the number if I need more tracks, like 5,000, and click Create Auto Tracks again. Now you'll see the distribution is very similar, so in this case we can change the minimum spacing. And changing the minimum spacing is going to create a denser distribution of tracking markers on the footage. In this case, I can probably get away with around 1,000, which gives us pretty even distribution. Once I've done that, I click on Auto Track. It's going to process those frames as well as perform the actual 2D track itself. Now, while these options are grayed out, I'm still going to point out what some of them do. We have options here for filter tracks. And these are going to allow us to automatically filter out the tracking markers that do not fit these certain rules that we are setting. So the minimum length is the minimum number of frames that a track can be active for. And we can increase this value or decrease this value as needed. And you'll see as I do that, it's going to change the number of visible tracks. The other one that's going to be active from the start is something called Smart Acceleration. And this is kind of a combination of looking at how fast a tracking marker is moving on the X, Y, or Z axis and trying to filter those out, saying, well, if it moves too much over a couple of frames, then it must not be a valid track. It must be kind of going off on its own. We also have a couple that aren't activated by default. There's an error threshold, and this one is great because if you only want to use low error value tracks, then you can set the error threshold to something that's quite low, and it's going to filter out any tracks that have a higher error threshold. You'll see that this is mostly the tracks in the background, but also if I disable this, you'll see that there's a couple of tracks that have actually been placed on vehicles here, as well as people. And turning the error threshold down is going to remove those sorts of tracks, just because these are aberrant tracks and they should not be used for the final solution. I can then move through time, and you'll see that as I do, some of the tracks are going to disappear. And this is just fine. At any point along the timeline, I can always click on Create Auto Tracks again, and then auto track from that point in time. So in this case, I'm tracking backwards in time now. Once that's done, you'll see that I have a new set of markers and then my original set. And I probably want to do one right in the middle here and auto track that as well. So once this is done, again, it's quite fast to do the actual 2D track. You'll see that I have a very nice selection of tracks there. I can then go to Reconstruct and run the 3D solver here. Under the reconstruction, we do have different solve modes, so this can handle nodal pans as well as planar tracks and full 3D reconstruction. So there is quite a lot of flexibility here over some of the other solutions that had previously been used for Cinema 4D. The other thing that we have in 2D tracking is manual tracking. And again, this footage is fairly clean, but let's say that there was specific areas that I knew would give me good tracks, like the wheels on this vehicle that are not moving. So I can use the Create User Tracks feature here, and with this active, I can simply click where I want to track, and then we'll go back to the motion tracker, and you'll see under the manual tracking, I have options here to control the pattern size and the search size for that feature, and then I can also name this. So I can call this Wheel 01, and with that set, I can click Manual Track and then take a look at the track itself. And that seems to be fairly solid, but it is a short-lived feature. So I can add another manual track, maybe just this area right here, and this can be the shipping container, and click manual track, and this is going to track both directions. And unfortunately, the track was solid enough that I did not actually lose the track. And sometimes it's funny to have to say that that's unfortunate, but in the case of demoing this, it is, because it would be wonderful to show you how you can update your tracks. So I'm going to break this track technically. To reset a track or set a keyframe on the track, all you need to do is go to a point before the track starts to lose its position, and then you can right-click and choose Insert Key at Track Position. When you do this, it inserts a keyframe for the tracking marker at the point in the time slider, and then recalculates the actual track itself from that point in time. You also have the option of clicking and dragging your tracking marker to a new position. And when you do this, you'll see that it's already trying to recalculate that. So in this case, I did break my track. But it's still pretty clean if I just undo. So once we have that, we have pretty much everything that we need. We can also trim tracks or untrim tracks. But pretty much that is really what you need to get going. From here, I could do several manual tracks, then go to my reconstruction and run that 3D solver. So this is definitely the big standout feature for the new version. It really gives the single user or the generalist a new tool in their tool bag to get in and work with footage quickly. The next big thing that we have for Cinema 4D version 16 is going to be the merger of the specular channel and the reflection channel. And this one is actually a pretty drastic change if you've been working with any previous version of Cinema 4D. So if I open up the material editor, you will see that the reflection channel and the specular channel are gone. And the only thing that we have left now is something called reflectance. The reflectance channel is going to contain everything inside of the material that deals with reflections. This even includes transparency. So if I enable transparency, you'll see that there is an option in here for transparency as well. So this new reflectance channel is really a catch-all for anything to do with reflections. And remember, speculars are a fake of a real reflection. So inside of this, we now have layers, and you can work with the layers if you want to or not. But basically, you'll almost be always working with two layers if you want to use a reflection with a specular. So in the menu here, you're going to see the default specular, and this is set to add mode. And we have normal and add, and we can kind of go over those a little bit later, as well as a global strength. And the global strength is going to allow us to, let's just get my interactive render region there. The global strength allows you to control the overall strength of the specific layer that you're working with. Now, the default specular is going to be an exact clone of versions before R16. And you'll see that you have the familiar width setting, the fall-off settings, and the specular strength. So all of these can be used just like before. Inside of the layer, you do see that you have a nice preview of the specular effect itself, as well as a representation of the fall-off. Now, we have a color in here, and this would control the specular color. So if I wanted that to be red, I would set that to red, and you'll see that the color that's being passed through here is now going to have a red hue. Obviously, I can set that back to white, and that's all fine. We also have a layer mask, and this can be used essentially like an alpha channel for your specific reflection or specular. And then we have these little triangles beside every single one of these parameters. And these little triangles are probably one of the most important additions to the whole reflectance channel, as every single attribute that you have inside the reflectance channel can now be modulated with a texture. So in this case, if I am using my specular, and let's just increase the strength and decrease the color value there so you can see that a bit better, I can now go into something like the width of my specular and add in noise. And if I adjust this noise with a, let's go for turbulence and set some clipping on there, you're going to see that what is being adjusted is not just an alpha for this, but the actual width of the specular. And so if I get something that's nice and smooth, we can get very nice, natural-looking specular highlights by modulating the width of the specular across the object. So I can do that with the width. I can also modulate the fall-off, the inner width, the specular strength, or even something called the bump strength. And the bump strength is interesting as it allows you to control the amount of influence that the bump channel will have over each of these individual layers. Okay, so we kind of have all of that, but what I want is to show you just what you have to do to work with reflections that would match older versions of Cinema 4D. So in this case, we need to add another layer to the reflectance channel. So we can click on the Add button, and this is going to give us access to all of the new shading models that you can find within the reflectance channel. So in this case, probably your go-to shading model will be Beckman. This is something that's going to give you something very close to realistic representations of blurry reflections, and that's really just how the blurriness is calculated as it gets further from an object. But we also are using one of the newest available shading models, which is GGX, which is probably the closest to being able to provide a wide range of solutions from diffuse fabrics to shiny metals. Then you have the classics, which are Fong, Ward. There's a new anisotropic model. The diffuse models are very cool because they can actually be used to replace the color channel. There's cloth, and then the legacy options as well. So in this case, we're going to add a Beckman layer, and this is going to override the specular. And you'll see as it renders, it's just kind of like any other reflection. inside of these layers, the order is actually going to matter, as well as this normal and add mode, and these are blending modes for these. So I'm going to call this my actual reflection, so we can rename those just by double-clicking on them, and then we can click and drag to change the order. And you'll see that when I change the order, which is having the default specular over top of the reflection, it's now adding the specular over top of the reflection. If I set this to normal, you'll see that it kind of ignores that reflection layer. And that's because it's essentially just blending the specular with the color channel, not the specular with the reflection. Okay, so I'm going to assume that there will be some questions kind of regarding this at the end, and that's just fine. It is a totally new sort of way to work with speculars and reflections, but just remember, when you do want a specular and a reflection, you're going to have the default specular on top set to add, and then a reflection as the lower layer. Now, let's say that in my reflection, I wanted to have something where I'm seeing some of the diffuse color underneath. And let's go ahead and set this to something crazy like bright green, and you'll see even now it's going to stay with just a pure reflection. In the attributes here for the reflections, we have sliders for the roughness, the reflection strength, specular strength, and the bump strength. The roughness is pretty obvious. It's going to control the actual roughness of this reflective layer. And that means it's going to allow you to have those kind of rough, polished surfaces. Obviously, it does render a little bit slower, and part of that is also my render settings here are a little bit high. So let's just drop those down a bit. Let's go 3, 1, and 3. And that should render a little bit faster for us. Now, if I want to start seeing the color through this, you might think of adjusting the reflection strength. But if we set this to 0, you'll see that I'm just going to get perfect black on my surface. And this is because the reflection strength and the specular strength don't actually change the way that these blend with the color channel. They're really just kind of determining the brightness of the reflection or specular inside of this reflection layer. The thing that's going to change the blending, you'll see if I just use the specular here, is going to be the attenuation. So the attenuation, if I set this to additive, will add my specular on top of the color channel. And this is different than the blending that happens up here. This blending happens between these specific layers, not the color channel itself. So the attenuation is what affects the color channel. So I'm going to set this back to average and then turn the reflection strength back up. So again, I want to have a subtle reflection, but not 100%. So in this case, when you want to lower the what would be considered the normal strength, you want to change the layer color. So rather than using 100% brightness, we can reduce this down to 50%. And that's going to make this reflective layer 50% opaque. So this gives me the blending that I want. Now, just like everything else, you'll see we do have texture slots to adjust each one of these. So we can use those. And we also have a link field for the layer color. And this is where we might add in gradients or materials or whatever else we want to control the color of our reflection, or even a Fresnel shader so that we can have that nice Fresnel effect that we remember. The reflectance itself, though, kind of eliminates the need for using that Fresnel shader. As if we look down the list, you'll see that there's a drop-down for layer Fresnel. And this will actually allow me to set dielectric Fresnel or conductor. And these are really handy if you want to use physically accurate Fresnel settings. Where you would want to use the layer color is if you want something that doesn't match reality, and then you would use that Fresnel shader. But in this case, I can just set the built-in Fresnel to dielectric and then set my index of refraction to get nice reflective properties out of that. We also have conductors, and conductors represent metallic surfaces. So this would be your chrome, your gold, and other. So when you're using the conductor presets, it's a good idea to disable the color. And when you do this, you'll now be able to choose any one of these presets here. So we could choose something like copper, and you'll see that this is going to give us a nice coppery tone to the reflection. If we set this to gold, it's going to give you that nice bright gold color. And we can adjust the roughness with that. So these presets, as well as all of the new options, do give you a lot more control over your reflections. And probably one of my favorite is still just the ability to have a texture modulate the roughness. So if I go in here and turn on a noise and set this to something a little more interesting, you'll see that we can get very nice variations in the blurriness of this texture. And maybe just put a bit more contrast in there so you can see that better. And so this sort of thing is going to be great for any time you need to create wood floors, concrete surfaces, anything that would have multiple layers of reflection. If you can imagine right now, I might have this gold sort of flakiness, and then I can add on another reflection channel and set this to dielectric. And now I essentially have gold that would have a clear coat on top of it. So these two reflections are being blended together now. The next thing that we have are going to be a lot of options for the anisotropic, and these have really been changed a lot. So you have options here for roughness as well as the actual anisotropy itself. And so the anisotropy is going to stretch the reflection along a specific direction on your object. And if I set this to 90 degrees, you'll see the reflections get stretched up and down now rather than across. So this is very basic anisotropy, but we can get a lot more control out of this. This starts once you add in a pattern as well as scratches. So I can start by adding primary scratches, which will add larger scratches to my surface. And I can adjust the scale of these so that we get something that looks a lot thinner. And it'll look like somebody had just brushed something across here. And depending on how you set the scale, that's going to change the actual resulting look. I can then go in and add a pattern. And when you add the pattern, that is going to actually create circular strokes. So if I increase the scale here and primary length, you see in your preview you get circular patterns. And in the render, we're going to have something that looks like somebody was using a polishing disc on this object. You see those go across quite nicely. And you can also use something like the lattice or diagonal. And these two options are great for creating a sort of carbon fiber look. And so in this case, we'll need to set up reprojection as well. And once we've done that, we can change the scale of the pattern, and that will make it so that it fits to this object a lot better. Okay. So there's definitely a lot in the reflections here that we can go over, and as you can see, I still haven't even managed to get through all of the different features of the different types. We still have the cloth presets, which are wonderful for anybody working with interior design or cloth, as it's going to give you a proper reflection model for cloth on objects. And if you just see here, I have very basic UVs set up on this owl. And right now the cloth pattern that you are seeing is calculated 100% through the reflectance channel. So this does give you a lot of options to play with. And there are some wonderful presets here for getting yourself started with different fabric types. The next thing that is going to be a really big feature is the polygon pen. And the polygon pen really allows you to up the ante for your modeling. And the polygon pen is essentially a full replacement for Create Polygon. And I'm going to start just in object mode here and hit Shift-C and then type in polygon. And you'll see here I have the polygon pen tool. As soon as I activate this, it's going to switch me to point mode, which means I can start creating new polygons right away. And by default, this is very similar to the Create Polygon tool. I can click around and it's going to add points in. The biggest difference here is this is all still fully interactive. So with the Create Polygon tool, once you created a point, you were kind of stuck until you went into the Move tool if you wanted to readjust things. With the Polygon pen, I can go in here and start readjusting these points instantly. And more so, I can actually select edges and move those. So I have a lot more flexibility in adjusting the position of these. If I hold down Control and Shift, I have the ability to create curves. And then I can click and drag to change the number of subdivisions along that curve. And then I can even click on that curve after I've created it to readjust the curvature. I can hold down Control if I want to remove those as well. So I can just click on a point and that will remove it from the polygon that I've created. And if I click on this lapse point, then it will actually kind of commit this polygon as a finished polygon. This doesn't stop my ability to adjust these though. If I want to go in and readjust any of these edges, I can do that, or readjust the points, and I'm still inside this polygon pen. So I'm not switching back and forth between different tools. I can even click on an existing point and cut across to create my quadrangle polygons. So I can use the polygon pen as a knife as well. And you'll see I can click on the middle of an edge to easily get that to split these edges as well. If I want to add additional points off the side, I can hold down Control and then click and drag, and you'll see that allows me to pull off a new set of edges here. So right away I'm adding in a lot more detail to this object. Depending on which component mode you are in, that's also going to affect the polygon pen tool in different ways. So if I go to edge mode and I want to create a new polygon, you'll see that I can click twice and that gives me a single edge. And then if I hold down Control, I can click and drag out to create a new edge. Now, if I have this edge floating out, as soon as I start getting close to an existing point, it's going to weld that together. So this allows me to easily create new amounts of geometry. And if I go back to the polygon pen tool, you'll also see that we have an option here to reproject the result. And this is perfect for doing things like retopology. So in this case, if reproject is on, it's going to snap to whatever surface I have underneath this object. So if we go back to the owl here, and just go Shift-C, and polygon pen. I can enter into the polygon pen, and we'll go with the polygon mode with reproject on, and I can click and drag, and you'll see that the polygon strip that I'm creating is flowing along the actual owl object. So this is really great for doing retopology. Switching into edge mode, I can then start pulling those edges off and creating the geometry that I want. Now, we only have a couple minutes left, and for that, I guess we'll call out a few of the smaller changes that are actually pretty big. One of them is going to be with animating your objects. So all of you knew that you had to hold down Control and click one of the animation dots to actually set animation on attributes. And this meant that you were often kind of bouncing back and forth between your modifier keys. In version 16, all of these animatable attributes have been switched to buttons. So if I want to record the X, I simply click on size X, and that sets my keyframe. I can then move to a new frame, adjust the attribute, and click again, and I now have the animation set. To adjust it, it's simply changing the value and then clicking again. You can also paint the attributes, so if I click and drag down, you'll see that I can set the keyframes for all three of those in one go. And again, this is just very nice because you don't even have to think about using your modifier keys anymore to set these keyframes. Another one of the features that I really enjoy is going to affect any of you that use MoText. And in this case, any and all multi-line edit fields in Cinema 4D have been given undo support. This also means for any of you doing programming or scripting, you can delete something in the script log and undo, and you don't have to worry about totally ruining your script. But in this case, we can just say type Novedge, and if we hit undo, you'll see that I can undo that one by one. So any of those changes that you can make are now undoable. And it's a little small thing, but it is quite wonderful. Some of the other standout features then would also be the addition of team render. So there is now a server option for team render, and in that case what you would do is open up your folder and you'll see that there is a C4D team render server, and this can actually be used to set up your team render. Now, I don't have it active, but this is something that a lot of people were asking for when 15 came out, and now we do have the server option for team render, which is going to be huge for single users that have multiple computers, medium studios, and large-size studios. So yeah, so from that would be kind of our big standout features. If there's any questions, I guess I will be fielding those now. Correct, Barbara?
Yes, thank you so much, Patrick. That is really exciting. Can you hear me? I hope so. Okay, there's one question, and it is about, I think, the owl. Does reflectance also work for realistic skin?
The reflectance can work for realistic skin. It would really just be a matter of setting up the shading model to match what you need. So in here, if I was doing like realistic skin, I'd probably go with something like GGX. The reason that I go with GGX is because when you have reflections that are very bright or very close, you'll see in the fall-off preview, those will stay very sharp, but then you get a very nice wide fall-off, which is something that is close to skin. Also, you can set this so that it is very wide on its own, and then add a second layer on top that has a sharper value. And then You would also probably want to use a layer mask just so you can have a little bit of value difference between those oily spots and more diffuse areas. The reflectance would also need to be mixed with subsurface scattering, so you'd want to make sure that you are mixing this with the subsurface scattering on there. Now, as far as setting up realistic skin, I don't have an example right away to show, but it would definitely be possible to use that reflectance model in the subsurface.
That was great. Thank you so much, Patrick. I think the questions,
no problem at all.
That was it. I think you were very clear and everybody seemed very satisfied with the presentation. Do you have a question that comes up in your circles that everybody asks about the new release?
Pretty much leading up to this release, the biggest things that people were asking about would be the team render stuff. Just wanting to know if there was going to be a server solution. And so that is kind of the biggest one that has been answered. And then, since a lot of people haven't actually had a chance to get their hands on this yet, I do see a lot of questions about reflectance coming up, just because it is such a new way of thinking about this. But I do hope that these videos will at least be able to suffice as a reference for people that kind of need something to look back on.
I am sure, and a lot of people asked if this webinar was being recorded, and of course it is, and it'll be available as early as this afternoon on our Novedge and Vimeo channel. So stay tuned, join our Facebook, Twitter, and social media accounts, and the video will be for you to watch over and over again. So Patrick, I'm going to switch back to my screen and wrap this fantastic webinar up. Let me know. Hopefully you can see my screen. Here we go. Okay, fantastic. I think I want to thank everybody for attending this webinar. I also want to remind you all to visit our page at novedge.com and check out the Cinema 4D bundle promotion. Novedge is the best way to buy design software online, bar none. And if you want to get the best out of our promotion, read our helpful blog post at blognovedge.com. Remember, this offer, which is huge, expires in 3 days, Friday, August 29th. For information on the latest specials and releases on a huge array of design software, also join the Novedge network and like us on Facebook, Google+, or Twitter. Coming up actually in 2 weeks, we have a webinar on architectural renderings with Rhino and Atlantis. Atlantis is a powerful, easy-to-use 3D rendering application developed especially for architects and designers, ideal for quickly and easily creating high-resolution 3D renderings and animation. To rewatch today's webinar or previous webinars, check out the Novedge Vimeo or YouTube channel. There's a lot to choose from in our playlist. Thank you for joining us today, and see you all next time. Thank you so much, Patrick, and it was great working with you.
Thank you very much, Barbara, and again, thank you to everyone who was watching.